Returning to the diplomatic building, everyone gathered around the round table to discuss the day's experiences. After trying out the chaos drinks for the first time, they all praised Evelyn. Amy mentioned that Evelyn is also a high awakened witch, and her drinks are incredibly delicious. She told 76 it was such a pity she missed it. Instead of continuing the conversation as she would usually do, 76 took a deep breath and then pulled out an envelope. She earnestly told everyone that she is a surviving Takira witch from the hidden labyrinth ruin, and her real name is Phyllis. The real reason she is here is to speak with the lord of the city of Neverwinter. Amy and the others widened their eyes in disbelief as if they thought they might have misheard. Despite their initial surprise, they were delighted to learn 76 was a witch just like them. Broken Sword curiously asked if Phyllis was her real name, to which she nodded. The reactions varied among the group, however, only Annie remained silent. Soon, Wendy arrived at the diplomatic building and escorted Phyllis into the castle, where she quickly met Roland and several other witches standing behind him. Phyllis placed her hand on her chest, slightly bowed, and introduced herself, revealing her true name and purpose. Roland, already briefed by Nightingale about 76's situation, was deeply interested in the hidden history from 400 years ago. Roland then invited Phyllis to sit down for a thorough discussion. Roland poured her a cup of tea, and before the discussion started, he emphasized the importance of understanding each other better if they were to unite against the demons. His first question was about how the Federation split into two factions. What was the real reason that caused the faction that created the church to relentlessly pursue witches? Why were they hunting their own kind? Roland had this question on his mind, especially after knowing about the existence of the perfect form of God's punishment army. Phyllis was quite surprised by the question, but she began to answer it nonetheless. She explained that before entering the labyrinth ruins underground, no one could have predicted things would turn out this way. Roland listened intently, his expression turning grave as Phyllis began to recount the events. Phyllis remarked that without those ruins, there would have been no God's punishment army project, and the remaining witches would have likely not survived. Unfortunately, they discovered it too late. According to Phyllis, they also found a method to transfer souls. At the same time, they also uncovered something else. It was because of these findings that the two leaders Natalia and Akris disagreed with each other, leading to the eventual split. Roland was curious about this so-called something else. What exactly did they find in the ruins? However, Phyllis shook her head, saying she couldn't reveal it unless Roland could find the chosen one. Then, Lady Pasha would personally speak to him. Roland, unfamiliar with the name, turned out Pasha was the next in line for the Federation's top 3 seats and a trusted leader among the surviving Takira witches. Roland still didn't understand why the faction split. If the perfect form of the God's punishment army meant that witches didn't need to die but existed in another form, why would Akris seek to hunt down the remaining witches? Phyllis shook her head, indicating that Roland had misunderstood. A bitter expression crossed her face as she revealed that the earliest vessel she used came from a failed God's punishment warrior. It took her 50 years to control that body, and if she wanted to utilize weapons and combat skills it would take her at least a century. But as more experiences they get, the gradually becomes easier when transferring into a new body. Roland voiced his thought, saying if that was the case, then Akris would need many of these God punishment warrior bodies. Phyllis nodded, explaining that once a witch is able to live forever, transferring their souls onto a God's punishment warrior will always be much stronger in every aspect than a newly transformed warrior. To continue this accumulation of combat experience and strength, more vessels were needed for soul transfer. Thus, these vessels could only be provided by weaker witches. Therefore, Akris needed to become the absolute ruler among the witches, allowing her to turn the weaker witches into disposable materials. Phyllis closed her eyes, seemingly very upset, and concluded that under the threat of the upcoming Third Divine War, Akris got all of the top high awakened witches to support her. Most of the Federation's upper echelons had also approved her methods. If not for the new discoveries in the ruins, the God's Punishment Army project would have been the only viable survival strategy. Roland pondered for a moment. Based on his previous understanding of the God's Punishment Army and what Ashes had once said, there was almost no difference in strength, speed, and reaction between an extraordinary witch or a God Punishment warrior. The only difference was intelligence. If a God's Punishment warrior possessed a witch's intelligence, alongside hundreds of years of combat experience, and almost an eternal life, this would be very terrifying. Roland realized that if they ended up encountering these kinds of God's Punishment Army against the church during the battle a few months ago, the outcome of the war might have been different. He then asked Phyllis how many God's Punishment warriors Akris planned to produce before the Red Moon. Phyllis bitterly responded, all of them. Akris planned to turn all of the witches into God Punishment warriors to fend off the demons. Roland first thought how terrible an idea this was, while also didn't find this to be possible and figured there weren't enough vessels reserved for soul transfer. Phyllis nodded and mentioned there's another method to preserve souls. They would first transfer the witches' souls into a different container, and then what they called hibernate. She regretfully informed that she could only divulge more once Pasha consented. This made it difficult for Roland to continue the discussion. Phyllis was completely secretive about crucial information and unclear about how the Chosen One could defeat the demons. For some reason, she only wanted to find this Chosen One first. Even seeing her being extremely reserved, Roland still agreed to help to find the Chosen One. Phyllis began to explain how to find the Chosen One using a ring. Later in the afternoon, Roland gathered all the witches in the back garden. Led by Wendy, they walked through a corridor formed by olive trees to a small yard. The first witch tested was Agatha. After observing, Phyllis shook her head. It wasn't Agatha. After the test, Agatha didn't leave the corridor. She hoped to observe alongside Phyllis as she was also interested in the results. Phyllis then respectfully performed a traditional courtesy to Agatha, thanking her for her trust and assistance. Next was Echo, then Leaf, and lastly Anna. Unfortunately, none of them were the Chosen One. Though some of the light shown through the ring were extremely impressive, but they were still far from the light she had observed the previous night within the castle. Agatha found this quite odd, as the witches would not practice their powers in their rooms during the night. After thinking for a moment, she thought of something and asked Phyllis to hand her the ring. If this person was truly inside the castle, Agatha knew Nightingale wouldn't let Phyllis enter the castle area during nighttime. If the Chosen One was really in the castle, Agatha would help find her. The night passed quickly, with Phyllis almost sleepless, anxiously awaiting the results. Wendy and Agatha came to the diplomatic building, finding the bright light that Phyllis spoke of, but unsure if it signified the Chosen One. Phyllis nearly jumped up in excitement, convinced that was no doubt the Chosen One. She excitedly asked if the person was a high awakening witch and wanted to know her name. However, the two didn't immediately answer, instead showing a mix of amusement and awkwardness. Agatha even coughed a few times, perhaps hinting at something. Phyllis felt as if she was hit by a truck. She stood up abruptly and asked if it was a he and not a she. Wendy nodded, revealing the orange light emanated was from His Majesty Roland Wimbledon. Phyllis couldn't believe it. How could a mortal king be the Chosen One? Agatha explaining that not just her, but Nightingale, Anna, Wendy, with everyone getting the same conclusion. Agatha later tested Roland with several magic stones, however, it turned out Roland bore no magical energy. Wendy then asked if the Chosen One had to be a witch. If Roland could become a hero who defeats the demons, it wouldn't be so bad after all, she added with a smile. Phyllis's heart sank, insisting that she hadn't seen any orange light from Roland previously. Agatha nodded, explaining that the light disappeared once Roland woke up, possibly due to Zero and the dream world. Phyllis, unfamiliar with these things, listened as Wendy briefly explained Zero's identity and speculated that the ring might have made an error because of this. Roland suggested that if Phyllis wanted to verify, they could try again at noon during his nap. Thinking for a moment, Phyllis picked up the ring, determined to see for herself. During the noon nap, the witches led Phyllis to Roland's bedroom, where she witnessed the orange light herself. Overwhelmed, she screamed and then fainted. When Phyllis regained consciousness, she found herself in a soft bed with Agatha on her side looking out for her. Agatha asked if she was okay. Phyllis took a deep breath, admitting she was just too shocked. She never imagined that after over 400 years of searching for the Chosen One, it turned out to be immortal. Seeing her expression, Agatha slowly said they might need to reconsider their view of the Chosen One and be more open-minded. Phyllis looked at her complicatedly, clutching her fist, fearing another failure after 2 consecutive losses over the Divine War. This was their last chance. Agatha interrupted her, earnestly saying if that's the case, then they can just defeat the demons once for all. Agatha didn't know what they had found or seen in the ruins, nor why Phyllis and the Takira witches pinned their hopes on it. Instead of these unpredictable things, why not believe in Roland? Agatha remarked how Roland led witches and mortals alike, constantly creating weapons capable of defeating the demons. With everyone's strength, she believed even mortals could overcome the demons. Phyllis looked at her, wanting to retort, but found herself speechless after seeing the confidence on Agatha's face. Agatha suggested that perhaps Phyllis and the other Takira witches should witness Roland's true power. And the key he held. Phyllis was confused about what keys was Agatha talking about. Agatha smiled while saying Roland called it the key of arts. Roland ascended the city walls, where the first army soldiers saluted him. Axe reported that things had been relatively quiet lately, with the demonic beasts appearing only in small hordes. Roland nodded, then shared his plan to stage a cannon demonstration on the city walls in the next couple of days. He wanted it to be very impressive, but without being too wasteful. Axe pondered for a moment before asking if Roland intended to fake it. Roland couldn't help but laugh, noting that Axe was getting to know him better. He shook his head saying maybe not fully call it faking it, but he planned to mix reality with some illusion, using live ammunition for precision shooting and pre-buried gunpowder for demonstrating firepower. He asked if Axe understood his plan, to which Axe immediately nodded. Roland outlined his idea, emphasizing the importance of making the final explosion the most spectacular, for which Axe could prepare extra gunpowder. Roland reflected on the morning's events, finding it somewhat funny. He had woken up to find Phyllis collapsed on the ground next to him. Perhaps after 400 years of arduous searching, only to discover that a mere mortal was the chosen one she had been seeking was understandably hard for her to accept. He hoped that this cannon exercise might help change Phyllis's perspective. Axe expressed some concern that this might lead the artillery battalion to misunderstandings about the cannon's real capabilities in future battles. Roland waved off the concern, explaining that he was ready to phase out these outdated black powder weapons, like the earliest 12-pound field guns, which were no longer suitable for future combat. He excitedly mentioned that he already had plans for the next generation of weapons. Roland smiled, revealing that he had many weapon blueprints ready, but first, he wanted to create a versatile, portable weapon that could be carried by a few people, had considerable firepower, was simple in construction, and was easy to operate. The weapon on Roland's mind was no other than the mortar. In the evening, Roland went to Anna's room. After knocking on her room door and entering, he gently picked her up from behind and carried her to the bed, where they lay down together. Roland wanted to continue talking to Anna about the dream world and his past life. He was well aware that Anna had always waited for him to open up. She never forced him and always patiently waited for him to share. So, tonight, Roland decided not to keep anything from her, intending to share everything tonight. Roland began to explain that the dream world was constructed based on his memories from another world. Anna seemed to read his mind and asked about where Roland lived in his dream. Roland described it as a tall building, similar to an apartment where many people lived together, each with a modest-sized suite. He mentioned that his room was shared with someone she'd never guessed. Anna suddenly asked if it was Zero. Roland coughed in surprise, wondering how she guessed it. Anna then shared her analysis, reasoning that since Roland's dream world emerged after defeating Zero on the Soul battlefield, it made sense that the dream was partly related to her. She was concerned that Zero had attacked him again. Roland shook his head, explaining that Zero had become a child, lost all her memories, and was very sensible. Anna smiled, saying if that's the case, then Roland should take good care of her. Surprised, Roland asked why, saying it was just a dream. Anna held Roland's head, saying just like Roland had previously said, if there was no difference from reality, why bother distinguishing it as a dream? Roland marveled at Anna's unique way of thinking and continued their conversation. As night darkened, they eventually fell asleep together. In case anyone is wondering, nothing happened tonight. Anyway, back to the story. The following day, when Roland opened the door to his office, Powerf and Edith were already waiting for him inside. Nightingale was lounging on a chair, reading a book and munching on dried fish. Powerf reported that the logistics for the southern offensive were complete, and the recruitment of reserve soldiers was going smoothly. He estimated that the total strength of the First Army would reach 7,000 by the spring of next year. Powerf was pleased, claiming that this force would be unrivaled in Grey Castle. Edith interjected, reminding Powerf that they weren't just facing foolish knights and nobles. Powerf seemed slightly displeased, but Roland smiled and agreed with Edith. They needed to prepare for the battle against the demons, and the army's expansion must continue. The more soldiers in the First Army the better, as long as it didn't hinder production. Edith then curiously inquired about Roland's cannon exercise. She suggested allowing the residents of Neverwinter to watch, believing it would greatly boost their enthusiasm to enlist and instill confidence in the future fight against the demons. Powerf objected, questioning why would Edith involve civilians in such an event, fearing they might misconstrue the explosions as divine punishment. Edith countered, asserting that with proper teachings no one would fear, even if people thought it as divine punishment they would still see it as under the king's control. She elaborated on her idea, considering limited seating, they could sell tickets at a low price to boost revenue. The audience would mainly consist of individuals aged 15 to 30, as they represented the future mainstay of Neverwinter. Edith had meticulously thought out the entire plan, and Roland was quite intrigued. What Edith brought up was very similar to a military parade. Deciding to proceed, he gave Edith the green light to implement it. In the bustling market, as May purchased some ingredients and passed through the square, she found it crowded with people. A man was announcing that His Majesty would hold a public cannon exercise in 3 days. May, curious, thought it must be another of the king's new ideas, something Carter would probably find interesting. Suddenly, May heard a faint sound of footsteps behind her. Turning around, she saw a young girl holding 2 salted fish. The girl lost for breath, handed the fish to May, insisting it was a token of gratitude that May must accept. Surprised, May learned that the girl had always wanted to meet her, believing her father would have been proud of May's performances. The girl's father, a First Army soldier, had died in battle. The girl and her mother had been sad for a long time, but after watching May's new play about heroes had given them new strength, just like what happened in the play, those who sacrificed for their family and kingdom were honored as heroes by the king. And now the girl, now referred to as the hero's daughter by everyone, felt closer to her late father and shared how much she wished if she was a boy, so she could join the army just like her father. May was moved and asked if the girl wasn't afraid of the risks of battle. The girl shook her head, recalling the previous hardship when they would always need to migrate to the Changu stronghold during the month of the demons. Many people died on the road, and even after arriving at the Changu stronghold refugee camp, many could not survive the winter. The girl believed that because there are people just like her father who are willing to make the sacrifice, they can now live in peace. The girl then repeated a line from May's play, which echoed in May's heart. Smiling, May accepted the girl's gift. The girl waved happily and ran back home. May soon returned home and told Carter she wanted to see the cannon exercise too. Surprised, as May usually disliked violence, Carter was taken aback by her sudden interest. May teasingly asked if Carter didn't want her company, to which he immediately responded that he wished to be with her every moment. Blushing, May playfully asked whom Carter would prefer to be with, her or King Roland. Carter was momentarily at a loss for words, perhaps having never considered choosing between loyalty and love. May chuckled at his reaction. Holding Carter's face in her hands, she playfully said it seemed her status was comparable to the king's. Suddenly, May felt nauseous and rushed to the bathroom, leaving Carter concerned. He thought she might have caught a cold and quickly got dressed to call Lily over. May stopped him, a hint of blush on her cheeks, hinting at a different possibility. She suggested that Carter could ask Sylvie over. Realizing what was happening, Carter's eyes brightened, and he hurried out. Left alone, May touched her belly, thinking about the young girl she met that afternoon. This must be what hope feels like, she thought. The next day, when Roland learned the news of May's pregnancy at the dock, he congratulated the excited Carter, reminding him not to neglect his duties and promising him a long vacation before the baby's birth. Carter's face beamed with joy. Suddenly, Roland realized an important issue. Did Neverwinter have a midwife? The chief knight, puzzled, asked what that was as he never heard the term midwife before. Roland realized that Neverwinter's healthcare was still rudimentary. Despite Manhwa and Lily's presence, which nearly eliminated all disease and pain, he had delayed establishing a proper medical system. But now, with hundreds of thousands of residents, a proper medical system is much needed. Carter assured Roland not to worry about his situation, mentioning Roland's sister was arriving soon. Not long after, a ship arrived at the dock. Tilly, along with Andrea, Ashes, and others, returned to the Western Territory. Tilly removed her hood and greeted Roland. Andrea then eagerly jumped in, asking Roland if there would be a welcome banquet this evening, her voice brimming with anticipation. Ashes coughed twice, subtly reminding Andrea to mind her manners. Roland chuckled and affirmed, saying winter was the perfect season for hot pot. Andrea's eyes sparkled with delight, and she began to praise Roland and said no wonder Nightingale liked him, but her words were abruptly cut short as an invisible hand firmly covered her mouth. Ashes, holding her forehead, turned away as if she saw nothing, while Tilly looked somewhat surprised. She glanced at Roland and then at where Nightingale was, and Roland, with a smile, suggested they head back to the castle and continue their conversation there. Back at the castle, both parties shared their recent experiences. Ashes was surprised to hear that Roland was the chosen one the Takira witches were searching for. Tilly humorously teased saying, or, perhaps, the first male witch in history. With a shrug, Roland brought the conversation back to the topic at hand after the joke subsided. He explained that the so-called chosen one was merely a term used by the Takira witches and that the specifics of their instrument and how it works needed further discussion with their leader. However, before that, he planned to conduct a canon exercise to restore the Takira witches' confidence. Ashes, recalling her first time seeing the weapons, added that it would also serve as a power demonstration. Roland highlighted that this exercise was also open to the public. He clenched his fist, hoping that once the townsfolk witnessed the power they had, they would be emboldened even in the face of demons. Andrea then suggested using demonic beasts as targets to make a more lasting impression. Roland thought for a moment, considering the idea. Andrea's proposal offered more spectacle, and nothing could be more exhilarating for the citizens of Neverwinter than seeing these longtime foes of the Western Territory annihilated by cannon fire. Andrea and Ashes volunteered to capture the beasts, while Iffy also offered to help. Wendy expressed concern about the dangers of capturing demonic beasts. Nightingale, seemingly eager to participate, reassured her that as long as they operated within Leaf's controlled area, there would be no danger. Tilly then proposed a warm-up competition before the cannon exercise. They would form 3 teams to see who could capture more demonic beasts, with a month's supply of chaos drink as the prize. Tilly was curious to see if this drink was really more delicious than the ice cream sandwiches. She also suggested having Phyllis participate, which surprised Roland. Tilly believed it would give Phyllis a first-hand understanding of the power behind Roland's weapons. Roland, looking at the expectant faces of Ashes and the others, nodded in agreement. After finalizing the plan to hunt demonic beasts, everyone gradually left. Iffy, headed straight to the 3rd floor of the diplomatic building, paused before knocking on a door, recalling how Roland had asked to speak with her alone just half an hour earlier. In a gentle tone, Roland reminded Iffy about her friend Annie, whom she had mentioned before joining the Blood Fong. Iffy nodded, puzzled as to why he was bringing this up. Roland then revealed that among the witches from Wolfheart, there was one named Annie whose story closely mirrored the Annie Iffy had spoken of. Iffy's eyes widened in shock and disbelief, whispering, "Is this really true?" Her expression was a mix of joy and guilt, seemingly afraid that Annie might not forgive her. Roland gave her Annie's room number and left it to Iffy to decide what to do next. Roland chose to not make this a surprise, as he was unsure of Annie's feelings towards Iffy. With the room number in mind, Iffy slowly approached the door, her steps growing hesitant as she neared. The fear of Annie's potential non-forgiveness weighed heavily on her. What if Annie couldn't forgive her? What would she do? Standing at the door, Iffy hesitated to knock. Suddenly, Shadowfeather and Nightfall appeared. "I knew you'd be like this," Shadowfeather said, with Nightfall looking breathless from the sprint. It seemed they had come out of concern for Iffy. Shadowfeather and Nightfall, having overheard part of Iffy's conversation with Roland, saying of course they need to look after Iffy, joked about guarding the door and locking it in case Roland tried to coerce Iffy. Iffy let out a helpless smile, saying how can Shadowfeather call that looking after? The jokes made her feel slightly relieved. She jokingly asked if they came to laugh at her, to which Shadowfeather shrugged with a smile saying maybe. As Iffy hesitated, Shadowfeather suddenly pounded on the door a few times and quickly ran away, leaving Iffy startled but with no choice but to face what lay beyond the door. Shadowfeather then turned to Iffy, advising her to just speak what she had on her mind. As the door creaked open, a tall witch appeared in front of her. It was Annie. Time seemed to freeze at that moment. Annie, seeing the girl before her, overlapped her with the memory of little Iffy. Tentatively, she asked, "Are you Iffy?" Iffy felt as if she had returned to the past, once again becoming that helpless and wandering girl. Tears began to stream down her face, memories flashing in her mind. Unable to hold back any longer, Iffy embraced Annie. She first sobbed softly, then cried loudly, apologizing to her repeatedly. Annie was initially stunned. When she opened the door, she didn't immediately recognize the witch standing outside, though she looked familiar. It was only when Iffy embraced her, crying and apologizing, that Annie recognized her. Seeing Iffy's uncontrollable weeping, any resentment Annie held towards Iffy seemed to dissipate. She remembered how thin and timid Iffy used to be. How could that very timid girl be able to stand up to the Blood Fawn's orders? Annie sighed deeply, gently wrapping her arms around Iffy, telling her that she no longer blamed her. Hearing this, Iffy trembled slightly and wept even louder. It took a long time for her emotions to stabilize. As the other witches approached, Annie, looking at the Iffy who had fallen asleep in her arms and then turned to Amy and the others, made a decision. She told them she was going to sign a contract with Wendy and serve the king. Standing atop the city wall, Roland watched the participating witches. He reminded everyone that the demonic beast hunt was about friendship first, competition second, and safety above all. The rules were simple: capture as many demonic beasts as possible while confining them in cages and return before sunset. He sternly added that anyone straying beyond Leaf's monitored area would be disqualified. As the contest began, Lightning and Maisie were the first to soar into the sky towards the misty forest. The teams consisted of Maisie and Lightning from Neverwinter, Andrea and Ashes from Slumbering Isle, and Agatha and Phyllis from Takira. With everyone off the wall, Tilly asked Roland who he thought would win. Roland speculated that Lightning and Maisie might have the edge due to their speed, despite not being as strong in combat as the others. Tilly, smiling, proposed a bet. And asked what the wager was. Tilly bet on Slumbering Isle's team, saying if she won, she wanted Roland to set up a fund to give half of the Chaos Drink revenue to reward witches who made significant contributions to the city's development. Roland, having similar plans, readily agreed and asked what if Tilly lost. Tilly, looking serious, said she would then stay in Neverwinter. Roland, surprised, glanced at her, realizing she wasn't joking. Tilly's eyes twinkled mischievously as she added that Roland might not win. Nightingale, appearing out of the mist, whispered in Roland's ear that she thought the same. Surprised, Roland turned to her and she informed him that Andrea's ability had evolved. Meanwhile, in the forest, the trees swayed as Leaf merged with the environment, monitoring the entire area while communicating with everyone. Leaf informed the Slumbering Isle team that a boar-type demonic beast was located 125 meters ahead to their left. Andrea, still getting used to Roland's new units of measurement, began to calculate with her fingers. Ashes rolled her eyes, removed her great sword from her back, and said she could already hear the footsteps. Soon, a black shadow emerged in the dense forest, a boar-type demonic beast sprinting towards them. Andrea told Ashes not to attack, as a single strike of hers would surely kill it. Blowing a whistle towards the beast, she provocatively called it towards her. The boar exhaled puffs, its crimson eyes fixed on Andrea, who seemed to be taunting it. The boar soon changed its target and charged at her. Andrea remained still, extending her hands with her index fingers and thumbs open, making a diamond shape. She could see the boar getting very close when suddenly, a powerful gust of wind burst from her palms. The boar, as if hitting an invisible wall, was flipped into the air and crashed to the ground, twitching with its limbs in the air, and then fainted. Andrea, with a smile, said that Ashes could handle the transportation. Ashes didn't want to do the dirty and laborious job, but Andrea reminded her that they represented Slumbering Isle in this competition, and if they lost because of Ashes would certainly embarrass Lady Tilly. Hearing this, Ashes took the matter more seriously, hoisted the boar, and quickly ran towards the cage under the city wall. Once Ashes was gone, Andrea looked up into the forest and asked Leaf to inform her of the next demonic beast's location. Leaf informed Andrea that there was another beast 450 meters away, but asked if Andrea planned to wait for Ashes. Andrea considered it, then decided it would be too slow, assuring Leaf that she could handle it alone. She started calculating the distance of 450 meters and began running, asking Leaf to inform Ashes of her location later. Meanwhile, in the Takara team, Phyllis looked at Agatha walking ahead and apologized, not expecting Roland to involve Agatha in such an activity. Agatha, however, didn't mind, seeing it as a good opportunity to get some exercise. Phyllis still felt uneasy, as Agatha was the youngest high-awakened witch in Takara. Following behind Agatha, Phyllis timidly suggested they just catch a few demonic beasts casually and call it a day. However, Agatha immediately dismissed the idea. Phyllis, puzzled, reminded her that Roland had emphasized friendship over competition. Agatha shook her head, explaining that although everyone agreed, their true intentions could be seen from everyone's expressions. Despite the talk of friendship, none of them, including themselves, wanted to lose to anyone, regardless of the reward. Agatha paused and then smiled, saying that if it were just an ordinary competition, it would be different, but they were representing Takara now, weren't they? Phyllis nodded and felt Agatha's fighting spirit. The two of them, taking Leaf's guidance, prepared for battle. A long, slender, white-furred flying demonic beast swooped toward them at high speed. Agatha used her ability to freeze the ground, then conjured ice crystals in her hand and launched them at the flying demonic beast. As the creature struggled on the slippery surface, Agatha quickly closed in while dashing towards the demonic beast and froze it solid. Phyllis admired her fluid combat style, a true worthy of Takara prodigy. As Phyllis prepared to carry the beast back, Agatha suggested they catch a few more before returning. They then set off in another direction in search of more beasts. It was then Phyllis realized that Agatha truly wanted to win the competition. But she wondered if the reason behind her enthusiasm was that they were representing Takara. She also wonders if Agatha was more inclined toward the survivors of Takara over the city of Neverwinter. This uncertainty made Phyllis uneasy. After a few minutes, she couldn't help but speak up, Lady Agatha. She called. Agatha turned around and told her to just call her by her name. Agatha reminisced about how Phyllis had once told her that the Takara witches no longer divided their status by the level of their abilities, but instead, treated each other as equals. She wanted to know more while telling Phyllis to treat her the same. Phyllis nodded, explaining that after the fall of Takara, the survivors had come to a consensus. Pasha had proposed that every witch was equally important, regardless of their previous status in the Federation. Agatha smiled and told Phyllis if that's the case, then there was no need for formality with her, even confessing her envy of the witch union's sisterly bonds. Phyllis, finally voicing her biggest doubt, asked how Agatha viewed the Takara witches in relation to the witches of Neverwinter. Agatha stopped and turned, perhaps understanding the underlying question. Phyllis wanted to know where her loyalties lie. She earnestly replied that her loyalty was to her beliefs. Phyllis, still confused, listened as Agatha expressed her hope that the other Takara survivors would settle in Neverwinter and join Roland in the fight against the demons. The conversation brought a quiet stillness to the snowy forest. Phyllis felt a sense of loss, lamenting that she had thought Agatha would stand with Takara. She reluctantly mentioned that Agatha still chose to represent Takara in the competition. Agatha clarified that she will always be a Takara witch and that would never change for her. Phyllis still struggled to understand why Agatha believed they should follow a mortal king. Agatha then spoke of the Federation's history, asking Phyllis if she had forgotten its original purpose. Phyllis firmly said it was to defeat the demons. Agatha nodded, explaining that after the First Divine War, witches unified the entire continent, took the previous nobles and kings' privileges away, then ruled over the ordinary people but still couldn't defeat the demons. However, Roland has proven that he has what it takes to defeat the demons. So why not serve under him? Agatha believed that there was only one person capable of unifying the world's secular powers and truly allowing witches and ordinary people to live in peace and equality, that is no other than Roland Wimbledon. Phyllis was settling for Agatha's words. She then asked if Agatha meant that Neverwinter was the new Federation. Agatha corrected that regardless of what it was called, the essence was the same. Their ultimate goal was to defeat the demons and win the Divine War. Ever since she awoke from the ice coffin, Agatha's sole goal in life was to defeat the demons, no matter whom she served. She expressed her desire to win the competition for Takara, which she didn't see as conflicting with serving under Roland Wimbledon. It was similar to how, 400 years ago, all witches from various groups united and served the Federation. The only difference now was that their leader was not the three seats, but a mortal king. Phyllis was unsure how to react, her feelings mixed, acknowledging that Agatha held Roland in high regard. Still somewhat stubborn, Phyllis insisted that finding the chosen one would change everything. Agatha smiled and noted that it had been 400 years, and they hadn't found this witch yet, or rather, they found a very unexpected chosen one. Agatha reassured Phyllis that if there truly was such a witch, she promised that Roland would not hinder them. Instead, she was certain that Roland would fully support their search and do whatever he could to help. She believed that if they moved to Neverwinter, more witches would be willing to settle there, increasing their chances of finding the chosen one. Phyllis found herself persuaded, albeit reluctantly. She quietly conceded that Agatha's words made sense, but added a condition: it all depended on whether Roland could truly withstand the demons. She then asked Agatha if she genuinely had that much confidence in this mortal king. Agatha smiled, sharing that she, like the other members of the Witch Union, deeply trusted Roland. She suggested that Phyllis would surely understand her confidence after witnessing Roland's prepared cannon exercise tomorrow. Just then, a loud roar echoed through the forest, causing Phyllis's expression to change abruptly. Recognizing the sound, she saw a giant flying creature appear above her, clutching a demonic beast in its claws. She exclaimed in shock, questioning why a demon would be here. Agatha calmly explained it was Maisie's evolved ability and not a demon. Phyllis calmed down and then remarked that capturing demonic beasts seemed too easy for Maisie. Agatha agreed that Maisie's ability was convenient, but noted that Maisie and Lightning lacked rigorous combat training, meaning they couldn't efficiently utilize their magical energy. Observing Maisie's enormous form, Phyllis understood Agatha's point: the two young girls wouldn't be able to sustain their effort until sunset. After their heart-to-heart talk, Agatha and Phyllis got serious about the competition. From that point on, Phyllis took charge of capturing the demonic beasts, while Agatha supported her on the side by restraining their movements. As the gray sky gradually darkened, Leaf announced the end of the competition. The teams gathered outside the city walls, where Wendy began tallying the scores. She pulled out a notebook and announced the results. The Neverwinter team scored 7 points. Phyllis was startled, looking at the nearly 100 demonic beasts in the nearby cages, surprised and wondering if the Slumbering Isle duo really captured the remaining 80 beasts. Lightning blamed Maisie for their low score, complaining that if she hadn't spent an hour raiding an eagle's nest and cooking eggs, they could have caught more. Maisie, in her pigeon form perched atop Lightning's head, cooed in protest, pecking at Lightning, insisting it was Lightning's idea and she had the most eggs. Wendy smiled at their bickering and continued, revealing that the slumbering L team scored 15 points, crediting Ashes for the success. Andrea protested, claiming she was the one who took down the demonic beasts, while Ashes merely fetched them. Hearing this, they too started arguing. Wendy, slightly exasperated, then turned to the last team, announcing that the Takira team scored 22 points, winning a month's supply of chaos drink. Andrea looked enviously at them, while Maisie hopped onto Agatha's shoulder, gazing longingly. Phyllis was surprised by their victory and wondered why were there so many demonic beasts then. Wendy explained that most of those were captured by Leaf. Leaf stepped forward, blushing as she recounted that she had set numerous traps around the hunting area, assuring everyone's safety. Concerned about too many beasts entering the area, she then dragged the trapped demonic beasts to the edge of the forests. But obviously, she can't just let these demonic beasts go, so she brought them back and prepared extra target dummies for Roland tomorrow. At this revelation, all participants turned their gazes toward the seemingly harmless witch. Leaf, looking slightly embarrassed, wondered if she had captured too much. The crowd was utterly silent, astonished that Leaf alone had captured more demonic beasts than all three teams combined. The next day, Neverwinter finally completed all preparations for the cannon exercise. The spectator stands had no empty seats, and soon Axe reported that the artillery battalion was ready. Roland nodded and turned to Echo, asking her to start playing the march music. Echo used her ability, and instantly, the familiar and resonant music filled the city wall. Soldiers began to ascend the wall, drawing the attention of everyone, especially the parents and families in the audience. As the soldiers climbed the slope to the wall, the crowd erupted in fervent applause. Eileen, sitting next to Ferlin, expressed regret that May couldn't witness the scene. Ferlin, smiling, reminded her that May was pregnant and couldn't stand on the wall in the cold, but there would be many more opportunities in the future. Eileen suddenly asked Ferlin if he wanted to be part of this exercise. Ferlin was momentarily shocked. She then teased him, sensing his rapid heartbeat. Ferlin pondered, musing that if he hadn't become a teacher and continued as a knight, he might have joined the First Army, serving as the King's Sword, fighting for Roland, and expanding the kingdom's territory to unprecedented extents. Watching the soldiers, he felt an excitement he hadn't experienced in a long time. Perhaps someday in the future, he could join them. The music stopped, and Axe, standing on the platform, lifted a flag and shouted the order to aim. All the cannons were targeted at the demonic beasts below the wall. One of the soldiers joked about his target beast's ugliness, and Vayner sternly told him to be serious. Another soldier, responsible for loading the cannon, was nervously aware of the many eyes on him. Vayner gave him a sharp look and reminded him to follow their practice procedures. The site became busy with the loading process. Soon, the soon-to-be-retired cannons all resonated in unison. As the deafening sound of the cannon fire reached the ears of the spectators, the shells had already landed near the demonic beasts. The massive explosion shattered the wooden cages, sending splinters, steaming blood, and flesh skyward. The intestines and limbs of the demonic beasts were scattered everywhere. The crowd erupted into frenzied cheers after the first round of cannon fire. The explosions continued, raising dust and debris in a seemingly endless stream, turning the area below the wall into a fiery apocalypse. Phyllis's expression changed noticeably as she witnessed the destruction. She finally understood the source of Agatha's confidence. With such power, even mortals could contend against the demons. This completely altered her previous beliefs. She isn't alone in thinking about this, but also of the three former alchemy chiefs who were deeply engrossed in the explosions. They didn't speak, but they all thought of the same thing. This was the true essence of chemistry. They looked at each other, having found their lifelong pursuit, and rushed towards the inner city to request a laboratory from Kyle. Cole was one of many startled by the explosions. Edith comforted him, asking if he now understood why she wanted him to stay in Neverwinter. After a long silence, Cole hoarsely acknowledged, questioning if it was because of this display of power. Edith shook her head, explaining that no feudal noble could stand against Roland Wimbledon's power, a fact many had yet to realize. Cole, reflecting on their own noble status, was told by Edith that they were no longer feudal nobles but must become nobles of a new era, integrating into the king's new rules. Cole seemed to understand a little bit but was still confused. Nevertheless, he nodded, agreeing to stay in Neverwinter and no longer insisting on returning to the Northern Territory. Edith nodded in satisfaction, gazing into the distance, and posed a thought-provoking question to Cole. Wasn't the prospect of exploring new rules and powers far more intriguing than managing the same piece of unchanged land? Watching his sister's reddened cheeks and her flushed excitement, Cole watching her sister's hair flowing on the city walls, and witnessing an expression he had never seen on her before. After the exercise, Phyllis visited Roland's office accompanied by Agatha. Her demeanor was noticeably different from before, using formal language rather than the demeanor she had previously shown. Roland, noticing this change, told her not to be so formal. Phyllis wanted to ask Roland a few questions she had pondered since the cannon exercise. Her first question was whether these weapons could be mass-produced. She said without the Chosen One and the inability to mass-produce these weapons, they would still face a difficult battle against the demons. Roland was pleased that Phyllis was asking questions. Before answering, he explained that the fortress cannons weren't just defensive weapons. Though heavy and seemingly immovable by human or animal force, with some modifications, they could become versatile weapons of both offense and defense, like tanks. As Roland elaborated, Phyllis struggled to comprehend the words coming out of Roland's mouth, but sensed their significance. And these so-called tanks must have been very powerful too. When she learned that such a war machine could move freely on roads while carrying such heavy weaponry, she initially imagined cannons strapped to demonic beasts. Before she could inquire further, Roland addressed her concern about mass production, confidently stating that he could cover the entire border city wall with much more powerful cannons within a year. This response left Phyllis inwardly gasping, as even trebuchets and ballistae couldn't be produced in such numbers in a short time. Phyllis then asked her second question. She observed that the final explosion during the cannon exercise didn't seem to be caused by the fortress cannon. So what was it then? Roland smiled, saying that with current technology, the thing that caused the explosion was just the lowest grade of their weapons. Hearing this, Phyllis felt a chill, wondering if Roland possessed even more formidable weapons. Roland sipped his tea and asked Phyllis to describe the last explosion. She thought for a moment and said it was like a newborn sun. Roland mentioned that explosions are limitless, and there are many weapons Roland used, which can be called the real sun. As he rambled on and spoke of completing 2 epic tasks before achieving such a feat, Roland followed up by saying they would first achieve radiant emission and find the distance to the sun first. Agatha interrupted him. Nightingale also chimed in, advising him it was not time for dreams at this time. Roland, returning to the subject, realized that Phyllis couldn't comprehend any of these terms. She looked at the mortal king with mixed feelings, then removed her ring. She told Roland that when she crushed the multicolored magic stone, the Takira survivors would sense her location and could communicate from anywhere, but they would need to make some preparations first. Roland then asked Agatha to take Phyllis to the castle hall to make the necessary arrangements. After leaving the office, everyone took a deep breath. Tilly then knocked on the office door and entered. Roland poured her a glass of chaos drinks, and they discussed the previous wager. Tilly, almost as if she had guessed what was on Roland's mind, said the bet was a draw at best. She smiled while saying if Roland would allow Leaf to participate in the competition, then she would have no chance. Roland smiled and agreed, saying it was a draw, but he still hoped Tilly would stay. This slightly shocked Tilly. Roland continued as he planned to allocate 30% of the chaos drinks revenue to a fund rewarding those who contributed to Neverwinter, regardless of whether they were witches or ordinary people. As they began to discuss the serious matter, Tilly quickly regained her composure. She coughed, teasingly asking about the previously mentioned 50% share. Roland explained that even 30% would amount to a substantial sum sufficient for a lifetime of comfort. The remaining funds would be used for Neverwinter's development, including housing for witches, necessary facilities, and salaries. In essence, the money would be spent where most needed. Tilly could also withdraw funds directly if she needed to. Even if it means using all the gold? Tilly inquired. Roland casually remarked that hoarding gold in the warehouse was merely taking up space. Tilly pondered for a moment and then, with a smile, agreed to Roland's proposal. Saying if his big brother says so, she can't say no. Though her acceptance seemed reluctant, the joy in her eyes tells another story. Finally, Roland discussed his plan to bring the Southern Territory under Grey Castle's rule this winter, pointing out that its customs and succession of power were vastly different from the four major kingdoms, and Roland would need Tilly's assistance for a complete takeover. He explained the sacred duel ceremonies of the Sand People to her. Tilly nodded, understanding that Roland wanted Ashes to participate in the combat, and agreed it was feasible. However, Tilly was curious why Roland suddenly took an interest in the desert, a region neglected by all previous rulers since Grey Castle's foundation. Roland revealed that the desert was not as barren as it seemed, but held untapped treasures. He pointed to the map and described the eternally burning ground fires and the salt crystals whitening the earth as signs of hidden treasure. He believed these could be key to Neverwinter's next phase of development. Tilly didn't probe further, only promising to inform Ashes before leaving the office. As Tilly left, she encountered Echo heading into Roland's office. Echo's first words nearly made Roland choke. She seemed surprised and then bit her lip, looking upset, saying, "Your Majesty, don't you need me anymore?" Roland felt a cold presence behind him as Nightingale's hand tightly gripped his shoulder. He explained that Echo had misunderstood him, and Axe hadn't informed Echo yet about the plan. Roland then elaborated on his plan. He wanted Echo to return to the Southern Territory to help Roland in ruling the place. With her status, Echo is the only person who could propose a sacred duel. He hoped Echo would represent Neverwinter in the south, win the duel, and become the great chief, unifying the entire Southern Territory. After hearing Roland's explanation, Echo relaxed, understanding the plan but expressing doubts about the feasibility of uniting all the Sand People through a sacred duel. Roland, with a smile, acknowledged her concern and shared that he had other methods. Whispering his strategy to Echo, she was visibly stunned, her eyes reflecting a mix of emotions as she questioned if the plan would work. Roland confidently assured her it would certainly work. After his words, Echo knelt on one knee, bowing her head in a solemn gesture, then declared, "By the three gods, the Sand People will never forget your grace." Roland immediately stood up, helped Echo to her feet, and took her hand, earnestly entrusting the task to her. With this, the preparations to subdue the Southern Territory were deemed complete. Meanwhile, under the labyrinth ruin, a creature with numerous tentacles was burrowing upwards, while swarms of demonic beasts roamed above them. A massive demon lay dead in a cave, frenziedly torn apart by mixed breeds of demonic beasts following behind. Elsewhere, a gigantic beast continuously drilling holes, its back carrying many demonic beasts. At the same time, many flying demonic beasts circled the skies. One of the tentacled creatures asked about the progress above. Another replied that the closest demonic beast had broken through to the third layer, with some anomalies below the labyrinth, including several charred corpses. Pasha turned to Celine, inquiring about the time needed to prepare the instrument. Celine, a bit anxious, admitted uncertainty but assured her she was doing her best, saying Eleanor needed more time to calculate the core. A nearby god's punishment warrior encouraged everyone not to worry, promising they would handle the demonic beasts. Some suggested they shouldn't have reclaimed the divine artifact so soon, arguing that letting the church exhaust itself and defend a bit more would have been better. The giant tentacled creature disagreed, doubting the mortals could hold Hermes. The two sides argued until Pasha's commanding voice silenced everyone. Pasha reminded them that now was not the time to quarrel. Having reclaimed the artifact, they had no way back. She stressed that the time for debate was before making a choice, and they shouldn't regret decisions made afterward. Suddenly, the labyrinth shook as if something heavy had fallen from above at great speed, appearing almost instantly before them. A blue creature crashed to the ground, swelling up as dozens of mixed-breed demonic beasts tore open its belly and attacked the nearby Celine. Pasha screamed in horror. Celine, clinging to the instrument, now surrounded by a dozen demonic beasts, fought off the beasts with her tentacles but was soon bitten. She screamed as several more beasts latched onto her. Other witches in their god punishment warriors' bodies rushed to her aid. Pasha looked worriedly. Celine, being their most knowledgeable about the magic core, couldn't be lost here. As more witches joined the fray, the demonic beasts were slain one by one, and the chaos subsided. Pasha approached the battered Celine, inquiring about her injuries. Celine, though in pain, reassured that she was not critically wounded, saying she needed to patch the holes right away. Despite her tears, Celine, clutching her broken tentacles, says it is very painful. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief seeing she was all right. One of the witches in god punishment warrior's body even jokingly remarked that Celine should be grateful to still feel pain, as most of them here had lost all sensation. Another witch nodded in agreement, suggesting that Phyllis would envy Celine if she heard this, as she could only experience such sensations mentally now. Pasha interjected, reminding them not to make jokes like that, as Phyllis was serving the mortals for the sake of Takira. The group nodded, wondering how the Chosen One project was progressing. One of them noted they would have to hold on for another 2 or 3 years. Another mumbled about enduring until the red moon, then meeting their end together, which earned a quick rebuke for being a pessimist. The comment sparked laughter among the group. Pasha urged everyone to be cautious, pointing out that new demonic beasts could attack them from the opening in the ceiling at any moment, potentially surrounding them from all directions. Deciding to gather on the same floor while guarding different entrances, they waited for Celine to repair the instrument. Soon, a new wave of demonic beasts appeared, and the fight resumed. At that critical moment, Celine's excited voice echoed in everyone's ears, as she joyfully said the core calculation is complete. The instrument is ready. One of the tentacled creatures turned to Pasha, asking her to activate the device while she helped defend the place. Pasha quickly climbed onto the instrument, touching its top with her tentacles and entwining her body around it while releasing her magical power. Instantly, magic surged through her, and the instrument's framework emitted an increasingly bright cold light. A pale blue wave of light burst from the core and spread rapidly, sweeping across the entire hall like ripples on the water surface in the blink of an eye. The nearby demonic beasts all came to a halt, and then slowly collapsed onto the ground. Pasha crawled over to check on the others' injuries. One of them lay on the ground, her body covered in black and blue blood, missing an arm. She was heavily injured but joked about how she needed a new body, lamenting how long it had taken her to choose this one and wondering if the next body would be more handsome and strong. Pasha, relieved that she was all right, then turned to assess the rest. Everyone had sustained various degrees of injury, but none were fatal. Over the long centuries of their 400-year existence, their numbers had never increased, and deep bonds had formed among them. She can't lose any one of them. Pasha reassured everyone, saying that as long as they were together, that was what mattered. She placed her tentacle on the witch's forehead as she was patting her head. While another tentacle creature returned from scouting, reporting no immediate large-scale attacks. The demonic beasts in the labyrinth were mostly dead. Celine then shared the bad news: 2 parts of the instrument were broken, leaving them without its protection for a week. Pasha remarked that even such activation could break the instrument, wondering what would happen if the Chosen One used it. Celine replied that their materials were of the poorest quality and couldn't meet the requirements of this very divine creation. One of them wistfully remarked that things would have been easier in the Federation, where they could have used gold, silver, and gems freely. Suddenly, the instrument started glowing, signaling that Phyllis had sent an urgent message. Pasha asked someone to confirm Phyllis's location, learning she was likely within the borders of Grey Castle. Hearing this, Pasha knew Phyllis had arrived where she needed to be. Pasha then pondered the reasons forcing Phyllis to break the magic stone. Could it be an accidental exposure or being seen as an enemy by the new generation of witches? Regardless, it was certainly not good news. When asked about the next steps, Pasha thought for a moment and then instructed them to continue activating the instrument tomorrow. Knowing this is very risky, but no matter what, they wouldn't abandon Phyllis. Back to Neverwinter, Wendy laid out the prepared contract on the table, welcoming the 4 new witches to the Witch Union. Wendy was both surprised and pleased when she learned that Annie had taken the initiative to join the union. Amy asked if they needed to test their abilities first. Wendy, with a smile, explained that there was no rush, the tests were usually conducted after signing the contract. Wendy had the witches gathered around to discuss the terms and ask questions about the contract. As they discussed, Wendy observed the witches whispering to each other, her mind drifting back to when she had signed her own contract. Amy was surprised to learn that they would receive a monthly salary of 1 gold. Hero was excited about the prospect of buying many things, while Broken Sword was astonished to see they even have paid time off, hardly believing the privileges afforded to witches. The contract even stated that witches had the right to terminate the contract if the king could no longer ensure their safety and sufficient food. Annie, surprised, asked if that wouldn't be considered betrayal. Wendy answered their queries with a smile, reminiscent of her own reaction when she first saw the contract. Though unspoken, she believed that even if Roland faced a crisis in the future, no one in the Witch Union would leave his side. She kept this to herself while assuring everyone that the terms of the contract were all genuine. Once all their questions were answered, all 4 witches signed their names. Annie handed the 4 signed contracts to Wendy, who joyfully declared that they were now truly sisters and welcomed them to the Witch Union. With the Witch Union gained 4 new members. Next, it was time to test their abilities. Annie was the first to be tested. Her ability was generating heat. It was quite simple. As she touched objects with her palm, the object would then be heated. Wendy tested her ability on a block of metal, which then began to sizzle and melt under her continuous heating. Wendy clapped excitedly, praising it as a fantastic ability, and assured that the industrial machining factory would warmly welcome Annie. During the test, Annie seemed unsure about the usefulness of her ability and didn't have much confidence in her ability, but Wendy's sincere expression prompted her to ask if her power was useful even if she had to leave her hands on the object. Wendy nodded affirmatively, saying that Annie's ability could be applied in many places and predicted that Annie would soon become a very busy witch in the union. Next was Amy, whose ability was self-heal was previously spoken of. Wendy didn't wish to test it as it would require Amy to get hurt. This was something she was reluctant to see. Hero's ability allowed her to transfer illnesses and diseases and can't be tested right now, but her ability made Wendy think of the care center as the perfect place for her. Perhaps Hero and Lily could assist each other effectively. Lastly, it was Broken Sword's turn. She clearly looked nervous. Broken Sword took a few deep breaths before demonstrating her power. As she channeled her magic, dazzling lights burst from her body, and when the light faded, Broken Sword disappeared, leaving a sharp blade embedded in the grass. It took Wendy a while to realize that this was Broken Sword's ability. Annie explained that Broken Sword couldn't hear her in this form, as she lost the ability to communicate when transformed into a weapon. Only when someone held her in their hands could she perceive the world through that person's senses. Wendy then picked up the broken blade, immediately feeling a surge of magical energy, as if another consciousness had merged with her mind, and almost as if the blade became an extension of her body. Broken Sword explained that as Wendy held her, all her power was granted and added to Wendy's. Though she regretfully mentioned that she had always been frail as a kid, and with limited strength and overall really weak, meant she couldn't offer much help, even when combined with Wendy. Wendy found Broken Sword's ability intriguing and inquired how long she could maintain her weapon form. Broken Sword explained that she could sustain it indefinitely without frequent transformations. Wendy immediately thought of Maisie, whose transformations also consumed a lot of magical energy, but lasted a long time. Maisie? Are you talking about that huge pigeon? Wendy heard this question in her mind. She was startled and then realized that Broken Sword could also hear her thoughts. This made her slightly panicked, as some thoughts were private and she didn't want anyone else to know. Feeling the fluctuation of Wendy's mood, Broken Sword also felt the weight she carried in the front, and it almost felt as if it was bonded by something. Broken Sword then innocently asked curiously about what was warped around Wendy's boing boing. Wendy, startled and embarrassed, hugged herself and inadvertently dropped Broken Sword. Wendy regained her composure then asked Annie if Broken Sword could connect with anyone. Annie clarified that theoretically, anyone could receive Broken Sword's power if she was willing, but she would only be a sturdy weapon under an ordinary person. Only in a witch's hands, Broken Sword would reveal her true power. Seemed to sense Wendy's apprehension, Annie reassured her that while their mind was connected, it didn't mean a Broken Sword could pry into her thoughts. As long as Wendy didn't focus on specific thoughts, Broken Sword couldn't detect them. Slightly calmed down, Wendy picked up Broken Sword again, and an eager voice immediately sounded in Wendy's mind. Broken Sword first apologized, and asking if she had said something wrong. Broken Sword felt a little downcast, but promised not to ask such questions again. Wendy reassured her it was fine and asked what Broken Sword saw while she was on the ground. Broken Sword described a sensation of utter darkness, devoid of sound or touch, almost as if someone was floating in nothingness. Realizing how unsettling this must be for Broken Sword when she suddenly dropped her, Wendy immediately apologized, promising never to carelessly put her down again. Learning more about Broken Sword's ability, Wendy discovered that even in weapon form, Broken Sword could be injured, but witches could enhance her durability, sharpness, and range with magical energy. Infusing magic into Broken Sword, Wendy swung the blade, generating a sharp airstream that sliced a branch in two. Broken Sword was surprised to learn Wendy's ability was wind and that she was a combat witch, remarking that with Annie, what Wendy just did wouldn't be possible. Wendy suddenly thought of Anna. She wondered how powerful it would be if Anna infused her magic into Broken Sword and then struck with full force. Pondering this, Wendy decided to leave this to Roland to continue testing Broken Sword's abilities. In Roland's office, Agatha walked in. She came to inform that the Takira witches had responded. In the underground labyrinth maze, Celine announced that everything was ready. The God's Punishment army, composed of all witches, slowly advanced forward. At the forefront, right under the instrument, stood 3 tentacled creatures. The witches behind them all looked extremely tense and serious standing in a row. They did not wipe the blood off their bodies, holding shields and swords in their hands. They had deliberately piled the corpses of demonic beasts on either side, creating a terrifying and hellish scene. Pasha thought if the mortals on the other end saw this, they'd surely be intimidated. Although not certain what was happening, but worst case scenario if Phyllis was indeed captured by the enemy. It was important to create a terrifying scene to deter those who might attempt to harm Phyllis. They had to show they were not to be trifled with. Pasha looked at the instrument and ordered its activation. They needed to know Phyllis's situation. As the instrument whirred into action, a large screen appeared in front of them, showing Phyllis smiling, seemingly in the middle of a conversation. She wasn't captured in a dark dungeon, but in a brightly lit hall. Spotting the screen, Phyllis showed a surprised expression and asked what had happened to them. Pasha and the others were momentarily lost for words, realizing that Phyllis's circumstances were different from what they had imagined. After a few seconds, they exchanged puzzled looks. Pasha explained that they had just fought a major battle, but everyone was safe, though they hadn't had time to clean up the corpses. Hearing this, Phyllis was skeptical and had some doubts. Either way, Pasha waved her tentacles at the God's Punishment witches behind her, ordering them to quickly clean up the demonic beast corpses and get them out of the labyrinth, complaining about the terrible smell. The witches behind no longer had serious looks on them, grumbling about the sheer number of corpses and their reluctance to touch the disgusting, sticky stuff. Someone whispered that they had spent a whole day gathering all the bodies and setting up the scene. Pasha coughed, cutting her off, and sternly instructed them to stop complaining and start moving the bodies. Agatha, who was standing beside her, let out a giggle, had guessed that they were worried about Phyllis's safety, and had set up the scene planned to intimidate the other side. Pasha looked at the blue-haired woman who was extremely familiar. Immediately Pasha yelled out Agatha's name.